Hi there, my name is Lacey, and on what should have been the happiest day of my life, my future mother-in-law accused me of stealing her family's treasured jewelry right before I walked down the aisle. One accusation shattered everything I thought was real. How did it all fall apart so quickly? And who really orchestrated my downfall? Before we dive in, tell me, have you ever trusted someone only to realize they were plotting against you all along? Let me know in the comments. The veil brushed against my cheek, softer than the breath I was struggling to control. I stood alone in the bridal suite, the air thick with the scent of roses that now felt almost too sweet. In the mirror, my reflection smiled nervously. A woman wrapped in white, clutching onto the last threads of the dream she had sewn together piece by fragile piece. This was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. The murmur outside the door began as a ripple, soft and almost curious. I tucked a stray lock of hair behind my ear, whispering to myself that it was nothing, just excitement, nerves. But then the ripple grew into a wave, crashing against the thin walls of the suite. The door slammed open, the hinges protesting as Darla stormed inside. She was a force, a hurricane compressed into silk and diamonds, and her finger found me with surgical precision. "You thief!" she spat, her voice slicing through the room. For a moment, all I could hear was the hammering of my own heart. I blinked, trying to make sense of the words that didn't fit the picture-perfect frame I had built for this day. A thief? Was she drunk? Confused? "You stole my mother's emerald ring!" Darla shouted, her voice rising like sirens. "The one she left for Evan's bride, not for some imposter." Gasps leaked through the open doorway. The guests, friends, family, people I barely knew but had welcomed into this sacred day, became a wall of eyes, widening in shock, narrowing in judgment. I opened my mouth to speak, but no sound came out. She advanced on me, each step deliberate. "Return it now," she demanded, "or this wedding will not happen." Somewhere behind her, I saw Evan. My heart stumbled when I caught the look on his face. Not outrage, not defense, but confusion. And worst of all, hesitation. He didn't believe me, or at least, he wasn't sure. The blood drained from my face as my knees threatened to give out. Around me, the murmurs grew claws, scratching into my skin. Words blurred into white noise. Thief, liar, disgrace. I reached for Evan with my eyes, pleading silently, begging for him to step forward, to laugh off the absurdity, to pull me out of this nightmare with one steady hand. He stayed where he was, rooted by fear or doubt or both. Whispers coiled tighter around me like a noose. Someone coughed awkwardly. A child cried somewhere beyond the doorway. I stood in the center of it all, a bride without a shield, without a groom, without a future. Darla's voice, sharp and cold, cut through the chaos once more. "Unless you return what you stole," she said, her smile tight and victorious. "This wedding ends here." I looked at Evan one last time. He looked away. The murmurs twisted into a low roar, humming against the stained glass windows that had once seemed so comforting. I stood frozen, the soft train of my dress trailing behind me like a tether I couldn't cut. My mouth opened to speak, to deny, to scream. But Darla's voice rose higher, sharper, slicing through any chance I had to defend myself. "She won't even deny it," she crowed, her tone triumphant. "Of course she won't." Faces blurred into a sea of suspicion. Every heartbeat felt like it was being broadcast through the stone walls of the church. I wanted to believe someone would step forward, would say this was madness, that this wasn't how family treated family. But no one moved. "Since she has nothing to hide," Darla said, her eyes narrowing into slits of icy satisfaction, "let's clear this up here and now." The room seemed to tilt around me as she made her demand, an inspection of my gown. Right here, right now, before everyone. My breath hitched, lodging in my throat like a shard of glass. I blinked at Evan, willing him to speak, to interject, to grab my hand and pull me out of this madness. His mouth worked open and shut, but nothing came out. Somewhere in the crowd, a woman whispered, "If she refuses, that's as good as admitting it." Another voice closer, "You can never be too careful with strangers." I wasn't a stranger. I was supposed to be their daughter-in-law, their family. But I saw it now, how fragile my place had been all along, how ready they were to tear it away. "I insist," Darla said, stepping forward until the space between us felt like a canyon filled with knives. "If you have nothing to hide, you won't mind." My skin burned under the weight of 100 stares. My legs trembled beneath the heavy dress, the delicate lace suddenly suffocating. I could. The restaurant glowed under dim golden lights, every table adorned with neatly folded linens and small vases of daisies. For a brief moment, as Evan squeezed my hand and led me inside, I let myself believe that tonight would be different, that the quiet ache that had lodged in my chest these past few days would loosen, even just for an evening. Soft laughter floated through the air, the clinking of glasses mixing with the low hum of conversation. Familiar faces turned toward us, smiling, nodding. I straightened my dress, smoothing down the skirt, willing myself to fit in, to be part of this tapestry Evan's family had woven long before I arrived. When the hostess called Evan's name, Darla appeared like a queen reclaiming her court. She kissed Evan's cheek and gave me a nod that barely skimmed politeness. Then, without missing a beat, she directed the hostess with a practiced air, leading their family to the grand table near the center of the room. I stood awkwardly in the aisle, waiting for someone to acknowledge me, to make space. "Lacey," the hostess smiled thinly, "you'll be right over here." I followed her gesture to a small table tucked in the corner, already occupied by a handful of children and 2 off-duty waitstaff helping coordinate the evening. My stomach dropped. Evan caught my eye from across the room, his mouth pulling into a guilty half-smile before he turned back to his family. I lowered myself into the chair, heart pounding against the polite smile I plastered on my face. During the toasts, when Evan's uncle stood up with a booming laugh to welcome the joining of 2 wonderful families, a sharp voice rang out from a table nearby. "She sure looks like she stumbled in from another world," a woman chuckled, her champagne glass catching the light. Laughter trickled around the room, awkward and forced. Evan looked down into his drink. No one, not him, not even Taryn, seated too far away to intervene, said anything. I blinked rapidly, forcing my face into something resembling amusement. I traced the edge of my water glass with my finger, willing the heat in my cheeks to cool. Maybe they were right. Maybe I didn't belong here. I clutched the folded wedding program tighter in my lap, the edges bending under my grip. My vision blurred slightly, whether from the low lighting or the pressure building behind my eyes, I couldn't tell. I laughed, a soft brittle sound, and no one noticed. And deep in the hollowed-out space inside my chest, something shifted. A crack, a splinter, the kind that doesn't heal clean. The community hall smelled of polished wood and old hymnals, a familiar scent that once brought me comfort. Now it pressed down on my shoulders like a heavy hand. The late afternoon light slanted through the high windows, casting long shadows across the gathering of familiar faces. Faces that turned toward me, smiling too quickly, their eyes darting away the moment mine tried to catch them. I walked among them, Evan's arm loosely draped across my back, but I could feel the subtle shift in the air. Words died mid-sentence when I approached, conversations pivoted on sharp heels. A few women offered half-hearted hugs, their hands barely brushing my sleeves as if touching me too much might leave a stain. Snippets reached my ears like poisoned darts. "Her people aren't like ours." "Rushed, maybe? You know how things are sometimes." "No real family history, no roots." I smiled politely, feeling the floor tilt beneath my feet. My breathing grew shallow, my dress feeling tighter by the second. I glanced at Evan, but he was laughing with his cousins, oblivious or choosing to be. The whispers grew teeth. Later that evening, in the midst of a small gathering meant to celebrate the upcoming wedding, Darla stood up with theatrical grace. She cleared her throat, calling for everyone's attention, and held a slim, lumpy package wrapped in bright red paper. "A little something," she said, flashing a smile so wide it looked painful. "For our sweet Lacey." The room turned to me expectantly. I stood awkwardly as Darla handed me the package, her manicured fingers lingering just a second too long. I peeled back the paper to reveal a scarf, thin, synthetic, fraying at the edges. "It's modest," Darla said, her voice sugary. "But it's the thought that counts." Laughter bubbled up around the room, soft and poisonous. Some clapped lightly, as if applauding a clever joke. My cheeks burned as I folded the scarf carefully back into the paper, every movement feeling like it took 100 years. Taryn caught my eye across the room. Her mouth was pressed into a hard line, but even she couldn't cut through the tide rising against me. I sat back down, scarf clutched in my lap, feeling smaller than I ever had in my life. In the hush that followed, I realized it wasn't just Darla. It wasn't just a few cold shoulders or clipped conversations. It was the whole room. Public opinion was shifting, turning against me with the slow inevitability of a tide. And I, foolish and dressed for a fairy tale, had walked straight into it without a shield. I bit down on the inside of my cheek, tasting blood, and smiled. Because what else was there to do? Across the room, Darla watched me, her smile serene, her hands folded neatly over her lap. There was no malice in her expression now, only calculation. And in that moment, I understood. She didn't want my acceptance. She wanted my erasure. The backyard glowed under the golden spill of string lights, the air rich with the scent of barbecue and freshly cut grass. Laughter floated lazily into the warm evening, and for the first time in days, I allowed myself to breathe, to believe that maybe, just maybe, things were going to be all right. Evan's hand brushed against mine as he leaned down to refill his drink, and I caught the ghost of a smile on his lips. The simple, familiar gestures felt like a balm, easing the raw edges that Darla's accusations had torn open. I closed my eyes briefly, savoring the fragile normalcy. Across the yard, Taryn excused herself to fetch another glass of lemonade. I watched her weave through the clusters of guests, her ponytail swinging, before I turned my attention back to a story Evan's cousin was telling about a disastrous fishing trip. It wasn't until later that I noticed the shift. Taryn had returned, but her face had changed. She lingered near the edge of the group, her eyes darting toward me, then away, as if she carried a secret too heavy for one pair of hands. I didn't know then what she had heard. While reaching for a drink near the porch, she had stumbled upon a conversation not meant for any outsider's ears. Hidden by the darkening shadows, she had heard Evan's voice, low and conflicted. "I don't know, Mom," he had said. "Maybe she's not really what we expected." Darla's voice had followed, a velvet trap. "It's not too late, sweetheart. Better a little embarrassment now than a lifetime of regret." Taryn hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but once the words lodged themselves in her heart, there was no one hearing them. Darla spotted her seconds later, her instincts sharp as glass. With a smile slicker than oil, she swept Evan away under the pretense of discussing seating charts, leaving Taryn frozen under the heavy burden of what she now knew. Back at the gathering, I felt the ripple of unease but couldn't name it. When Taryn tried to cross the patio toward me, Darla intercepted her with casual cruelty, pulling her into another conversation, tethering her in place. I caught Taryn's glance, quick, frantic, but misunderstood it as nerves, as pre-wedding jitters. I laughed too loudly at someone's joke, my ears ringing with the sound of my own forced happiness. The sun dipped lower, and the lights twinkled brighter, trying to mask the growing fracture lines that spidered silently through the night. Later, alone in my room, I laid my wedding dress across the back of a chair. The satin gleamed under the lamplight, its train spilling like liquid promises across the floor. I sat by the window, arms wrapped around my knees, staring out at the stars struggling to pierce through the heavy Austin haze. I wanted so badly to believe in the dream still hanging by a thread in that room. But somewhere deep inside, beyond the reach of hope or stubbornness, I felt it. The quiet shift, the hairline crack widening, the certainty I had clung to so tightly beginning, slowly to slip through my fingers. The bridal suite smelled faintly of gardenias and pressed linen, a scent that usually made me feel calm, anchored. This morning, it only made my stomach churn. I sat by the window, smoothing the fabric of my wedding dress across my lap, breathing deeply in through my nose, out through my mouth, trying to slow the rush of thoughts that came too fast, too loud. For one moment, I let my eyes close. I imagined walking down the aisle, Evan's face at the end of it, smiling. A life that felt steady, safe, finally ours, a future I thought was still within reach. The fabric shifted beneath my fingers. I felt something foreign hidden inside the folds near my waist. My heart stuttered. I stood up quickly, reaching down, fingers trembling as they brushed against a small, hard shape. A bracelet. My bracelet. The one my mother had given me for my 16th birthday. The one that had gone missing months ago. Cold metal pressed against my palm, as if mocking me. I knew then, with crystalline certainty, this wasn't an accident. This was a trap. The room swayed gently, the edges of my vision blurring. Panic bubbled under my skin, but I swallowed it down, locking my spine straight. I tucked the bracelet into my palm, forcing my face blank. No one could see me break. Not here, not now. A soft knock at the door startled me. I tucked the bracelet behind the bouquet on the vanity as the wedding coordinator stepped inside, clipboard clutched tightly against her chest. She looked nervous, almost guilty. "Lacey," she said softly, not quite meeting my eyes. "We've had a request to inspect your personal items before the ceremony, just to clear up any concerns." Concerns? The word lodged itself in my chest like a thorn. I said nothing. I only stared at her, the room spinning slower now, settling into a cold, deadly focus. Comply, and I would be humiliated publicly. Refuse, and their suspicions would harden into certainty. They thought they had me pinned. Without a word, I walked to the vanity. My fingers were steady as I picked up the bracelet and placed it carefully atop the polished wood. I didn't explain. I didn't plead. I simply stood there, hands at my sides, daring her, daring them all, to find a thief where there was none. The coordinator hesitated, her face flushing. She mumbled something about checking later and backed out of the room, leaving me alone with the thick, vibrating silence. Outside the door, the murmuring had grown louder. I could feel the crowd gathering, the collective hunger for a scandal to feed on. I turned back to the mirror. The woman staring back at me wasn't the same girl who had stepped into this room dreaming of happily ever after. This woman knew better now. I adjusted my veil, smoothing it down with careful, deliberate hands. If they expected me to break, they would have to try much harder. The clock on the wall ticked too loud, each second stretching longer than the last. The kitchen smelled like old coffee and faint lemon soap. The windows cracked open to let in the heavy Austin night air. I sat at the worn table, hands wrapped around a mug of cold tea I hadn't touched. My wedding dress, packed away in a box by the door, felt like a ghost haunting the room. Across from me, Cliff sat silent, his fingers drumming lightly against the table. He hadn't said much since I arrived 2 days ago, just offered me a place to land when the ground under me gave out. Now he pushed a manila folder across the table, its corners dog-eared from handling. "I didn't want to," he said, voice rough, "but you need to see this." I opened it with trembling hands. Inside were copies of donation receipts, dated just weeks before the wedding. Large sums, all from Darla, funneled into the church's fundraising campaigns. Attached were emails, polite but unmistakable, expressing gratitude for ensuring everything goes smoothly for the upcoming union. It wasn't charity, it was payment. My vision blurred, but I forced myself to read every line, every damning word. "They bought them," I whispered, not sure if I was speaking to him or to myself. "They bought the whole damn ceremony." Cliff didn't respond right away. He just sat there, solid and steady, the kind of presence that asked nothing and offered everything. His silence wasn't passive like Evan's. It was heavy with anger barely held in check. I looked up at him, feeling the burn of tears that I refused to shed. "You're not going to tell me what to do, are you?" He shook his head. "No, kiddo. You get to decide. This time, you choose." The weight of it pressed against my chest, heavier than the accusations, heavier than the broken promises. Because now, I couldn't pretend it was just a misunderstanding. It wasn't fear or confusion or bad timing. It was deliberate. They hadn't just tried to exclude me. They had orchestrated my humiliation. The anger I had buried deep, smothered under layers of hope, of stubborn loyalty, flickered to life. It wasn't a wildfire yet. It was a spark, cautious but insistent, lighting up the hollowed-out spaces inside me. I pushed the folder back across the table. The decision wasn't hard anymore. It was frightening in how simple it had become. That night, I sat alone by the window, tea now long forgotten. The lights of the city blinked in the distance, but I wasn't looking at them. I was looking inward, where something old was breaking apart, and something new was sharpening into shape. Outside, the rumble of thunder crawled across the sky, low and warning. I lifted the cup to my lips and drank the cold tea without flinching. "I'm done playing nice," I said, my voice low, almost reverent. And somewhere inside me, a bridge burned clean through the night. Darla's house was bathed in artificial warmth, the kind that made your skin crawl if you stood still long enough. Candles burned on side tables, soft music whispered from hidden speakers, and the air smelled too much like vanilla, masking something sour. I stepped inside, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. This was supposed to be a gathering to clear the air, Darla had insisted. A small, casual meeting to mend fences, she had promised Evan. A show, carefully staged, and I had agreed to play my part one last time, if only to see the final act for myself. People smiled at me with brittle teeth, their greetings clipped and too bright. Darla floated from group to group, offering drinks and fake concern, her performance flawless. I moved cautiously, avoiding the traps of small talk, anchoring myself to the edges of the room. It happened so fast, it almost felt unreal. One of Evan's distant cousins bent down to retrieve a fallen napkin and froze. He knelt there for a moment longer than necessary, then reached under the couch. When he stood, the emerald ring, Darla's precious heirloom, glinted between his fingers. The room inhaled sharply. The ring had never left this house. It had never been stolen. A slow, creeping silence filled the space between us. Darla's face tightened, the mask slipping just slightly at the edges before she caught it. Evan paled, shifting from foot to foot like a boy caught lying. No one spoke. No one apologized. The lie hung in the air, heavier than any accusation had been. Evan moved first. He crossed the room toward me, his hands half raised, palms out in surrender. His words stumbled over themselves. "It was a mistake," he mumbled. "Mom, she didn't mean for it to go this far." I stared at him, the distance between us growing wider with every heartbeat. His excuses buzzed around me like insects I couldn't bother to swat away. The guests began to disperse, some mumbling goodbyes, others pretending to check their phones, desperate to slip out of a scene they could no longer deny, but had no courage to confront. No one said sorry. Outside, the air was cooler, the evening stretching long and empty ahead. I leaned against the porch railing, feeling the wood rough under my palms, grounding me. Evan found me there, his shoulders hunched like a boy expecting punishment. "Please, Lacey," he said, his voice cracking. "You have to understand. The pressure. Everything was so complicated." I watched him search for the right words, for anything that would paint him as a victim of circumstance, rather than a man who had stood by and watched me be dismantled. "I'm sorry," he finished weakly, and for a moment I almost pitied him. Almost. I pushed off the railing and turned to face him fully. "No," I said, my voice quiet but unyielding. "I'm done understanding." His mouth opened, but no sound came out. I didn't wait for more excuses. I didn't owe him another second. I walked away from him, from the house, from the lies that had built themselves around me like a prison. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The ring might have been found, but something far more precious, my trust, had been shattered beyond repair. The city pulsed outside my window, a low and steady heartbeat that didn't need me to catch up. I sat cross-legged on the floor of my small apartment, a cardboard box half unpacked beside me, my phone buzzing where it lay abandoned on the kitchen counter. I already knew who it was. The screen flashed Evan's name again and again, like a ghost that hadn't realized it was supposed to stay dead. Eventually, I stood and crossed the room, the bare wood cold beneath my feet. I picked up the phone, thumb hovering over the screen before I finally answered. "Lacey." Evan's voice was brittle with something that sounded almost like hope. "Can we meet? Just once?" I said nothing for a moment, watching a hawk drift lazily over Lady Bird Lake. Then I agreed, because closure sometimes demands to be witnessed. We met at a small cafe tucked between an art gallery and a bookstore, places I once would have loved to explore with him. Now they felt like museums of a life that had never belonged to me. Evan sat hunched over his coffee, stirring it without drinking, eyes flickering anywhere but at me. "I talked to my mom," he began, his voice low. "She's willing to move past everything. If you apologize." I blinked once, slowly, letting the words sink into the hollow space where my heart used to echo for him. "Apologize," I repeated, as if I needed to hear the absurdity aloud. He nodded eagerly, mistaking my calm for consideration. "Just a simple apology, for everyone's sake, to keep the peace." I studied him. The man I almost married, who now sat before me offering terms as if betrayal could be negotiated down to a polite nod and a swallowed truth. I realized then that Evan didn't want to fix anything. He wanted to forget it had ever been broken. I stood up, gathering my purse over my shoulder, with a movement so smooth it felt rehearsed. Maybe it had been, in my dreams every night since the wedding fell apart. "Thank you," I said, and Evan's face brightened, misreading the gratitude. "Thank you," I repeated, "for making this so easy." I left before he could find more words to hurt me with. The late afternoon sun was warm against my back as I walked home. By the time I reached my apartment, the heaviness I'd carried for so long felt lighter, like setting down a burden I hadn't realized was never mine to bear. I unpacked the last box, my books, my lesson plans, and shelved them with hands that no longer shook. The silence of my apartment wasn't lonely. It was mine. I sat at the small desk by the window, a fresh journal open in front of me. The pen glided across the page before I could second-guess myself. I wasn't meant to shrink to fit into someone else's story. I'm writing my own. I placed the pen down gently and leaned back, feeling the Austin breeze slip in through the open window, warm and sure. And for the first time in months, I breathed without apology. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that you should never apologize for protecting your peace. Sometimes the people you love the most will ask you to shrink, to stay silent, to become smaller so they can stay comfortable. And sometimes choosing yourself will mean walking away with nothing but your dignity intact, and that's enough. I learned that real love doesn't demand your silence. It doesn't barter your worth for approval, and it sure as hell doesn't ask you to apologize for existing. What about you? Have you ever had to walk away from something or someone you thought you couldn't live without? I'd love to hear your story. Drop a comment below and let's connect. Tell me where you're watching from, or simply type 1 if this story touched your heart. And if you didn't enjoy it, I'd love to know why. Your feedback means everything. If you found something real in this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. There are so many more journeys waiting to be shared, and I'd be honored to have you along for the ride.